I stared at my phone in disbelief. $103,420 transferred. My entire inheritance gone. 2 hours later, Kenneth texted me. I want a divorce. I've found someone else. After I had saved his family business from crushing debt, he left me without a backward glance. His mother even had the nerve to say, "We always knew you weren't right for him." But what none of them realized was that I'd discover a secret bank account that would turn their perfect little world upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The confirmation email from the bank seemed to pulse on my screen, the numbers burning into my vision. 103,425 transferred successfully. I remember feeling a strange sense of peace in that moment. I had just given away every penny of my inheritance, money my parents had worked their entire lives to save, to rescue my husband's failing construction company. But I didn't hesitate. That's what you do when you love someone, right? You help them when they're drowning. I closed my laptop and looked around our modest home. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Or so I thought. The framed photos of Kenneth and me on our honeymoon in Maui. The vintage record player he'd given me for our first anniversary. The worn leather couch where we'd spent countless evenings planning our future together. All these fragments of a life I believed was solid and real. If someone had told me then that within 24 hours, that life would shatter completely, I would have laughed in disbelief. My phone buzzed with a text from Kenneth. Meeting running late. Don't wait up. Another late night. There had been so many lately. I told myself it was because of the business. Troubles. The stress of nearly losing Hammond Construction. The company his father had built from nothing. I made his favorite pasta and left it in the fridge with a note. Proud of you. Love always, Brianna. I went to bed alone, as I had so many nights before, comforting myself with the thought that things would get better now. The debt would be paid. The business would recover. We would start trying for the baby we'd been talking about. My clinic dreams could wait. We were investing in our future together. I slept deeply that night, unaware that it would be the last time I would sleep, in our bed. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. Kenneth's side of the bed hadn't been slept in. Strange, but not unprecedented. Sometimes when work ran extremely late, he crashed at his office. I called his cell, straight to voicemail. I texted, "Everything okay?" 3 agonizing hours later, my phone finally buzzed. "I want a divorce. I've found someone else. I'm sorry." 17 words. That's all it took to demolish 3 years of marriage. I called immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Voicemail again. I called his office. The receptionist, Demi, sounded uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Brianna. Kenneth asked not to be disturbed today." "Demi, this is an emergency. My husband just asked for a divorce via text. I need to speak with him." A long pause. He's not here, Brianna. He called in this morning and said he'd be working remotely for the next few days." Working remotely? Kenneth never worked remotely. He always said face-to-face leadership was essential in the construction business. "Please, Demi. Do you know where he is?" Another pause, longer this time. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but he's with Nicola. They left together for the airport this morning, some kind of business trip to Miami. I'm so sorry, Brianna. Nicola, my husband's marketing director." Tall, confident Nicola with her perfect hair and designer clothes. I'd met her at the company Christmas party last year. She'd been overly friendly, asking about my work at the hospital, about our plans for children, about my inheritance. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The timing wasn't a coincidence. I transferred the money, and less than 24 hours later, he was gone. With her. I hung up without saying goodbye to Demi and sat down hard on the kitchen floor, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. The coldness of the tile seeped through my pajama pants as the truth seeped into my consciousness. I had been used. The late nights, the business troubles, the desperate plea for help. Had any of it been real? My phone buzzed again. A text from my mother-in-law, Sylvia Hammond. Kenneth told us what happened. We think this is for the best. We always knew you weren't right for him. The cruelty of those words cut deeper than Kenneth's betrayal. For 3 years, I had brought homemade soup when Sylvia was sick. I had organized her 60th birthday party. I had spent countless Sundays in her living room, listening to the same stories about Kenneth's childhood over and over. And all along, she had been thinking I wasn't good enough for her son. I didn't respond. What could I possibly say? The next few hours passed in a blur. I called in sick to the hospital, something I never did. I tried Kenneth again and again, voicemail every time. I called his father, his brother, his best friend Jacob. No one would take my calls. It was as if I had suddenly ceased to exist in their world. By evening, I had moved from shock to a cold, clear anger. I opened my laptop and logged into our joint bank account. Empty. Kenneth had withdrawn everything, leaving a balance of $43.27. 3 years of my salary, my overtime shifts, my careful saving, gone. I sat back, struggling to breathe through, the panic rising in my chest. No husband, no savings, no inheritance. What was I supposed to do now? That's when I remembered something. As a nurse, I had always been the organized one in our relationship. I kept a folder of all our important accounts, passwords, and documents. Kenneth had teased me about it, calling me his personal secretary, but he'd been happy enough to let me handle all the paperwork of our lives. I found the folder in my desk drawer and began methodically working through it, checking each account, assessing the damage. Our joint credit card, maxed out. Our investment account, emptied last week. Our savings account, closed entirely. It was while reviewing our tax documents that I noticed something odd. A mortgage interest statement for a property I had never heard of. A vacation home in Vail purchased 18 months ago. How was that possible? We could barely afford our modest home in Denver. Kenneth had said the business was struggling for at least 2 years. How could he have purchased a vacation property? With a growing sense of unease, I kept digging. There was an account number on the property tax statement that didn't match any of our known accounts. Using Kenneth's standard password, his mother's maiden name followed by his birth year, I managed to log into an online banking portal I had never seen before. What I found made my blood run cold. An account in Kenneth's name only, with regular deposits going back 3 years, the entirety of our marriage, large deposits. The most recent one, dated yesterday, was for $100,000. Almost the exact amount of my inheritance, but that wasn't all. There were transfers to another account holder, Nicola Carter. Regular transfers starting 2 years ago. Payments for what? And there were other transactions, payments for a Mercedes I didn't know about, expenses for trips I hadn't been invited on, restaurant bills from places I had never been. My husband had been living a double life, funded by my hard work and, ultimately, my inheritance. As the truth of my situation sank in, something strange happened. Instead of collapsing into tears, I felt an icy clarity take hold. Kenneth thought he had left me with nothing, but he had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated me. He had forgotten that I was the one who managed our accounts, who kept our records, who knew all his passwords. He had forgotten that before I was his wife, I was a woman who had put myself through nursing school after losing both parents in my early 20s. I was someone who had faced loss before and survived, and most importantly, he had left behind evidence. Digital breadcrumbs of his deception. His secret bank account didn't just show his betrayal, it provided the proof I would, Need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Carter? This is Brianna Hammond. I need to speak with you about your client, Kenneth Hammond. Yes, it's urgent. It's about fraud. Carter Blake was the best divorce attorney in Denver, known for his ruthless efficiency and perfect record. Kenneth had no idea what was coming for him. As I waited for Carter to come on the line, I looked again at the bank statement showing the transfer of my inheritance. What had felt like an ending this morning now felt like something else entirely. A beginning. Carter Blake's office was exactly what you'd expect from Denver's most feared divorce attorney, sleek, minimalist, and intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a subtle reminder to clients that from here, you could see everything. Nothing could hide. "Let me get this straight," Carter said, leaning back in his leather chair, his piercing, blue eyes fixed on me. "Your husband convinced you to transfer your entire inheritance, over $100,000, to save his supposedly failing business. Then, immediately after the transfer cleared, he left you for his marketing director, emptied your joint accounts, and is currently in Miami with her on what his office is calling a business trip." I nodded, my hands clutched tightly in my lap, to hide their trembling. "And I've discovered a secret bank account where he transferred the money, along with evidence of regular payments to Nicola going back 2 years. A hint of a smile touched Carter's lips. It wasn't a warm smile, more like a predator who had just spotted vulnerable prey. But in this case, the prey wasn't me. "Mrs. Hammond, do you know why I have a 6-month waiting list for new clients?" "Because you're the best," I answered simply. "No," he replied, standing up to gaze out at the Denver skyline. "It's because I only take cases I know I can win, cases with clear evidence of wrongdoing, cases where justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable." He turned back to me, and this time his smile reached his eyes. "Your husband made a critical error. He left a digital paper trail. And based on what you've shown me, this isn't just a divorce case. This is fraud, pure and simple." For the first time since receiving Kenneth's text, I felt something other than despair. A flicker of hope. Yes, but something else too. Something unfamiliar that took me a moment to identify. Power. Carter outlined what would happen next. Freezing the hidden accounts, filing for divorce on grounds of financial fraud, demanding full financial disclosure, and potentially involving law enforcement. "Kenneth will try to claim the money was a gift for the business," Carter warned. "Do you have any documentation showing it was intended as a loan or investment rather than a gift?" My heart sank. No, I trusted him. I didn't think we needed paperwork. Between husband and wife. Carter nodded, unsurprised. "That's common, unfortunately. But don't worry, the timing alone is suspicious. Add the hidden accounts, the apparent double life, and the fact that the business may not have been in financial trouble at all. We have more than enough to work with." As I stood to leave, Carter fixed me with an intense gaze. "Mrs. Hammond, Brianna, this process won't be easy. It will get ugly before it gets better. Kenneth and his family will fight dirty. They'll try to paint you as naive, greedy, vindictive. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the last 3 years, the overtime shifts at the hospital, the home-cooked meals left in the fridge, the genuine love I had given to a man who had been lying to me all along. I thought about his mother's text. "We always knew you weren't right for him." "I'm a trauma nurse, Mr. Blake," I said, straightening my shoulders. "I've held people's lives in my hands during their worst moments. I've delivered terrible news to families and then helped them find strength they didn't know they had. I can handle whatever Kenneth throws at me." Carter nodded, seeming satisfied. "Then I'll see you next week. In the meantime, don't contact Kenneth or anyone in his family. Don't post anything on social media. And, most importantly, don't tell anyone about the hidden accounts. The element of surprise is our greatest advantage. As I left the imposing glass building that housed Carter's office, I felt strangely lighter. The betrayal still hurt, a physical ache in my chest that wouldn't go away. But now there was something else alongside it. A sense of purpose, a path forward. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly have imagined, was that this was just the beginning. That the evidence I had uncovered so far was merely the tip of an iceberg of deception that would ultimately reveal something far bigger than a cheating husband. I couldn't have known that one day, less than a year from that moment, I would stand in the doorway of my own medical clinic, watching as Kenneth Hammond was led away in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed. I couldn't have known that the woman who walked into Carter Blake's office that day, broken, betrayed, and nearly penniless, would emerge. From this ordeal, not just financially whole, but transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The divorce filing hit Kenneth like a thunderbolt from a clear blue sky. He had been back from Miami for less than 24 hours when he was served papers at his office. Papers that didn't just seek an equitable division of assets, but specifically mentioned undisclosed accounts and fraudulent financial activity. He called immediately, his voice a mixture of rage and panic. "What the hell is this, Brianna? I was going to be fair about the divorce. We could have handled this like adults." I remained silent, following Carter's explicit instructions not to engage. "Are you there? Say something." "You can't possibly think a court will believe these ridiculous accusations. My business was in trouble. You offered to help. It was a gift, between spouses." When I still didn't respond, his tone changed, becoming softer, almost pleading. "Bree, come on. I know you're hurt. I handled things badly, and I'm sorry for that. But dragging my reputation and my family's business through the mud won't make you feel better. Think about what you're doing." I almost laughed at the audacity. 3 days ago, he had ended our marriage in a text message after stealing my inheritance. Now he was concerned about handling things appropriately? "My attorney has advised me not to speak with you," I finally said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Any communication needs to go through him." "Your attorney? Carter Blake? Are you serious? Do you have any idea what his hourly rate is? Where? Are you getting that kind of money?" It was a valid question. I was staying with my friend Demi from the hospital, sleeping on her couch, picking up every extra shift I could to pay Carter's retainer. But Kenneth didn't need to know that. "Goodbye, Kenneth." "Wait." I hung up and blocked his number. The next day, a formal response came from Kenneth's attorney, Jacob Wilson, a childhood friend of his who had become a lawyer. The response denied all allegations of financial impropriety and characterized my inheritance as a gift freely given to support Hammond Construction during a temporary cash flow issue. What it didn't contain was any mention of the secret bank account or the property in Vail. Carter was pleased. "They don't know what we know," he said when I came to his office to review the filing. "That gives us leverage." The next 3 weeks were a blur of legal procedures, financial forensics, and emotional upheaval. I moved through my days on autopilot, working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, meeting with Carter, trying to piece together my future from the wreckage of my past. Kenneth made several attempts to contact me through mutual friends. His mother left venomous voicemails about how I was trying to destroy their family legacy. Nicola, in a particularly bold move, even came to the hospital, claiming she needed to clear the air and explain their relationship. Security escorted her out while my nursing colleagues watched in disbelief. The rumor mill went into overdrive. I became that poor nurse whose husband left her for his marketing director after taking all her money. The pity in their eyes was almost harder to bear than the betrayal itself. But through it all, piece by piece, Carter's team was building our case. The financial investigator he hired uncovered not just the Vail property and the hidden bank account, but evidence suggesting Hammond Construction had never been in financial trouble at all. The company's tax returns and internal financial statements told completely different stories. Based on these records, Carter explained, showing me a spreadsheet highlighting the discrepancies, Hammond Construction has been consistently profitable for the past 5 years. The financial crisis Kenneth described to you appears to have been entirely fabricated. I stared at the numbers, struggling to comprehend the depth of the deception. But why would he lie about that? Why not just ask for a divorce if he wanted? To be with Nicola? Carter's expression was grim. Because the settlement wouldn't have been as favorable to him as getting your inheritance first. This wasn't just about leaving you for another woman, Brianna. This was a calculated financial strategy. The revelation left me breathless, as if I'd been punched in the stomach. It wasn't just that Kenneth had stopped loving me. He had targeted me from the beginning. The entire marriage had been a long con, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. 6 weeks into the divorce proceedings, I found myself sitting in Carter's office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, reviewing a new batch of financial documents that had been obtained through discovery. The conference room table was covered with papers, bank statements, tax returns, property records, the paper trail of my failed marriage. "There's something I don't understand," I said, pointing to a recurring line item in Hammond Construction's expenses. "What's Project Phoenix? It appears every month for the past 2 years, but it's not tied to any specific construction contract." Carter frowned, making a note. "Good catch. I'll have our financial investigator look into it." I continued scanning. Documents, my nursing training making me methodical, detail-oriented, looking for anomalies like checking vital signs. Something that doesn't fit the pattern could be the key to diagnosis. "Wait," I said suddenly, pulling a statement from the pile. "This transaction, 5 days before our wedding, Kenneth withdrew $50,000 from his personal account and transferred it to—" I can't make out the recipient. Carter took the paper, examining it closely. "I'll find out. Anything withdrawn that close to your marriage date should be considered marital property, especially if he was trying to hide assets." As I drove back to Demi's apartment in the rain, I found myself thinking about how I'd ended up here. Not just in this legal battle, but in the marriage itself. How had I missed the signs? Had there been red flags I'd ignored? Kenneth and I had met at Denver Memorial Hospital 3.5 years ago. I was working a night shift in the ER when they brought in his father, Richard Hammond, who had fallen from a ladder at a construction site. Nothing life-threatening, a broken arm and mild concussion, but enough to keep him overnight for observation. Kenneth had arrived 20 minutes later, impeccably dressed in a suit despite the late hour, his concern for his father immediately apparent. He'd thanked me profusely for taking care of his dad, his warm brown eyes holding mine a beat longer than necessary. "Your father's going to be fine," I'd assured him. "He's mostly worried about getting back to work." Kenneth had smiled ruefully. "That sounds like Dad. Hammond men are known for 2 things, our work ethic and our loyalty." The irony of that statement now made me wince. He'd asked me out 3 days later when he came to pick up his father. Our first date was at an upscale restaurant downtown, where he'd impressed me with stories about Hammond Construction, the family business his grandfather had started, and his father had built into one of Denver's most respected construction companies. "One day it'll all be mine," he'd said, his expression a mixture of pride and pressure. "Dad's planning to retire in a few years, and I'll be taking over completely." I was charmed by his ambition, his clear love for his family legacy. Coming from a family that had been shattered by my parents' early deaths, the Hammond family's tight-knit bond seemed like everything I'd lost and longed for. Kenneth had been attentive, generous, interested in my work and my dreams. When I told him about losing my parents in a car accident during my 2nd year of nursing school, he'd reached across the table and taken my hand. "You're incredible," he'd said, "to go through that and still finish school, still dedicate yourself to helping others. I've never met anyone like you, Brianna." Our relationship had progressed quickly after that. Within 6 months, I was spending weekends at his downtown loft, meeting his family for Sunday dinners, being incorporated into his world. His mother, Sylvia, had seemed welcoming enough, always asking about my work, my background, my family. Now I realized she'd been assessing me, not as a potential daughter-in-law, but as a potential asset. The proposal came at 9 months, on a ski trip to Breckenridge. Down on one knee in the snow, the ring glittering in the winter sunlight, Kenneth had seemed like something from a fairy tale. "You're the missing piece I've been waiting for," he'd said. "The perfect partner for the life I want to build." I hadn't hesitated. I'd said yes through happy tears, believing I'd found my happy ending. The wedding was small but elegant, a Hammond family tradition, Sylvia had explained. Mostly their friends and family, with just a handful of my nursing colleagues representing my side. I'd been too busy with wedding planning and my hospital shifts to notice how little input I'd actually had in the ceremony, how the guest list of 150 people somehow included only a dozen people I knew personally. I'd been so grateful to be welcomed into their family, so eager to please, that I'd let Sylvia make most of the decisions. The Hammond way, she'd called it. Family traditions. After the wedding, we'd moved into a house in a nice Denver neighborhood, not extravagant, but comfortable. Kenneth had insisted on keeping our finances mostly separate, for now, with a joint account for household expenses. "It's simpler this way," he'd explained. "Once we have kids and you're working less, we can reconsider." It had seemed reasonable at the time. I was independent, used to managing my own money. And with my inheritance sitting untouched in a separate account, money I'd been saving for either a clinic of my own someday or for our future children's education, I hadn't been concerned about financial security. The first year of our marriage had been good. Not perfect. Kenneth worked long hours, and sometimes I felt like Hammond Construction was his true spouse. But we were happy. We traveled when we could, talked about starting a family soon, built what I thought was a life together. The changes had been so gradual I barely noticed them. Kenneth staying later at the office, more business trips, less interest in our future plans. When I brought up children, he'd cite business stress, the need for financial stability first. And then came the night he'd told me about the business troubles. We were having dinner at home, a rare evening together. He'd seemed distracted, picking at his food, checking his phone repeatedly. "What's wrong?" I'd finally asked. He'd set down his fork with a sigh. "I didn't want to worry you, but the business is in trouble. Serious trouble." I'd listened in growing horror as he described how a major client had backed out of a project after materials had already been purchased, how the bank was threatening to call in loans, how they might lose not just the business, but our house, our savings, everything. "Dad's a wreck," he'd said, his voice breaking. "This business is his legacy, his life's work. I can't be the one who loses it all." I'd reached for his hand across the table. "We'll figure it out. How bad is it?" "Just over 100,000, he'd admitted. "If we can't cover the immediate debts, we'll have to declare bankruptcy. The Hammond name would be ruined in this town." I'd thought of my inheritance. Almost exactly that amount. Money I'd been saving for my dream clinic. But Kenneth was my husband, and his family had become my family. "I have the money," I'd said. "My inheritance." He'd looked up, his expression a mixture of hope and hesitation. "Brianna, no, that's your parents' money. Your dream. You're my dream now," I'd said. "We're a team. We'll rebuild together once the business is back on its feet." The next morning, I transferred the entire amount to the Hammond Construction business account. Kenneth had been overwhelmed with gratitude, promising to make it up to me, assuring me it was a temporary setback. 2 days later, he was gone, and I discovered it had all been a lie. The rain was coming down harder as I pulled into the parking lot of Demi's apartment complex. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching the raindrops race down the windshield, feeling the weight of my own naivety. I had been the perfect target, an orphan with a substantial inheritance, no family to ask, uncomfortable questions, and a deep longing for the family connection I'd lost. Kenneth had recognized my vulnerability and exploited it perfectly. My phone buzzed with a text from Carter. Financial investigator found something. Come to the office tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. Important. I stared at the message, my heart racing. Whatever they'd found, it was significant enough that Carter wasn't waiting for our regular weekly meeting. Tomorrow would bring answers. And from the urgency in Carter's message, they weren't going to be answers I liked. Carter's office was eerily quiet at 8 a.m. The usual buzz of paralegals and assistants was absent, and the reception desk was unmanned. I found Carter in his conference room, accompanied by a stern-looking woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. "Brianna, this is Alexis Morgan," Carter said as I took a seat. "She's the forensic accountant I hired to investigate Hammond Construction's finances." Alexis nodded crisply, her expression giving nothing away. "Mrs. Hammond, what did you find?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Something in their demeanor told me this was worse than I had imagined. Carter slid a thick folder across the table. "Project Phoenix," he said simply. I opened the folder to find documents, spreadsheets, and what appeared to be architectural renderings. At first glance, it looked like plans for a luxury condominium development. "I don't understand," I said, looking up in confusion. "What does this have to do with Kenneth and my inheritance?" Alexis cleared her throat. "Project Phoenix is a $20 million development that Hammond Construction has been planning for the past 2 years. A luxury condominium complex on prime real estate in Aspen. According to these documents, they've secured funding, obtained permits, and are scheduled to break ground next month." I stared at her, the implications slowly sinking in. "But Kenneth told me the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, that they were about to lose everything. The company is in excellent financial health," Alexis replied, her tone matter of fact. "In fact, the last fiscal year was their most profitable on record. This development is poised to double their net worth." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Then why would he need my inheritance?" I whispered. Carter and Alexis exchanged glances. "That's where things get interesting," Carter said, his voice unusually gentle. "Your money was never used to pay company debts. The day after you transferred, the entire amount was moved to a separate LLC named Phoenix Holdings." He slid another document toward me, a business registration for Phoenix Holdings LLC. The listed owners made my blood run cold: Kenneth Hammond, Nicola Carter, and Sylvia Hammond. They used my inheritance to fund their personal investment in this development, I said, the pieces finally falling into place. "They didn't need it to save the company. They wanted it to increase their own stake in the project." "Exactly," Alexis confirmed. "But that's not all. Look at the date this LLC was formed." I checked the document, 18 months ago. Long before Kenneth had claimed the business was in trouble. Long before he'd asked for my inheritance. "This was planned," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "They planned to take my money all along." "It gets worse," Carter said quietly, pulling another document from the folder. "This is a prenuptial agreement between Kenneth Hammond and Nicola Carter dated 2 weeks ago. They're planning to marry as soon as your divorce is finalized." The prenup included explicit mentions of protecting Kenneth's interests in Phoenix Holdings LLC and ensuring that Nicola would receive a percentage of profits from the development regardless of the marriage's success. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it left me numb. This wasn't a husband who had fallen out of love or even simply cheated. This was a coordinated financial scheme that had included his mother and his lover, probably from the very beginning. there's one more thing you should see, Alexis said, handing me a final document. A bank statement from a Cayman Islands account in Kenneth's name. We found this during our investigation. It appears to be where some of Hammond Construction's profits have been diverted over the past 5 years. The balance made me gasp. $3.7 million. But, in our divorce filings, he claimed total assets of less than $500,000, I said, struggling to process this new information. Exactly, Carter said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. And that, Mrs. Hammond, is called perjury. It's also tax evasion, fraud, and possibly embezzlement from the family company, if his father wasn't aware of these accounts. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we'd discovered. My personal betrayal, painful as it was, now seemed almost secondary to the larger scheme Kenneth had been running. What happens now? I asked. Carter's smile widened. Now we use this leverage. I've already drafted an amended divorce petition based on Alexis's findings. We're demanding full disclosure of all assets, including the Cayman accounts and Kenneth's interest in Phoenix Holdings. We're also seeking the full return of your inheritance plus punitive damages for fraud. He'll fight it, I said. Let him try, Carter replied, confidence radiating from him. If he does, we'll be forced to submit all of this evidence to the court, evidence that could lead to criminal charges. My guess is that once his attorney sees what we have, they'll be eager to settle. What about his father? I asked, suddenly thinking of Richard Hammond, the man whose medical care had brought Kenneth into my life in the first place. Does he know what his son has been doing? Alexis and Carter exchanged glances again. That's unclear, Alexis admitted. Some of the documentation suggests Richard might be unaware of the Cayman accounts and the extent of Project Phoenix's financing. He's listed as a board member of Hammond Construction, but not as an owner of Phoenix Holdings. I thought about Richard, a gruff but fundamentally decent man who had always treated me kindly, who had built his business through decades of hard work, only to have his son potentially undermining it from within. He should know, I said firmly. Whatever happens with the divorce, Richard deserves to know what Kenneth has been doing with the family business. Carter frowned. Legally speaking, that's not advisable. Bringing a third party into this could complicate our strategy. But I held firm. This isn't just about my divorce anymore. If Kenneth is embezzling from Hammond Construction, Richard is a victim too, just like me. After some discussion, we reached a compromise. Carter would proceed with the amended divorce. Petition immediately. Once Kenneth and his attorney received it, they would have 5 days to respond. If they refused to negotiate a fair settlement, I would have the option of contacting Richard directly. As I left the office, my mind was spinning, with everything I'd learned. The depth of Kenneth's deception went beyond anything I could have imagined. He hadn't just betrayed me as a husband, he'd orchestrated an elaborate financial scheme that had ensnared me from the very beginning. I drove to the hospital in a daze, grateful that my nursing work required such intense focus. For the next 12 hours, I could lose myself in caring for others, push aside the chaos of my own life. But as I changed into my scrubs in the locker room, my phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number, but I immediately knew who it was. We need to talk. Urgently. This isn't what you think. Meet me tonight? Kenneth. He must have already heard from his attorney about our amended filing. I showed the text to Demi, who had become my fiercest protector through this ordeal. Don't you dare meet him alone, she said, her normally gentle face hardening. He's panicking because he's caught. This is just another manipulation. I knew she was right. But a small, twisted part of me wanted to see his face when he realized I had discovered everything, wanted to watch him try to lie his way out of this. I won't meet him, I promised Demi. Carter said no contact. But as I slipped my phone back into my locker, I couldn't help but wonder what Kenneth's next move would be. Men like him, men who built their lives on lies and manipulation, rarely surrendered without a fight. Whatever came next, I needed to be prepared. The stakes had just gotten much, much higher. Kenneth's panic manifested in predictable ways. First came the barrage of texts from different numbers when I blocked his original one. Then the flowers delivered to the hospital with increasingly desperate notes. Next, the chance encounters. Him waiting by my car after a night shift, appearing at the coffee shop near Demi's apartment. Each time I followed Carter's advice. No engagement, no response, document everything. He's trying to get to you outside legal channels, Carter explained during our weekly meeting. Classic move when someone knows they're cornered. Don't give him the opportunity. 3 days after we filed the amended divorce petition, Kenneth's attorney requested an emergency meeting. Jacob Wilson, Kenneth's childhood friend turned lawyer, looked distinctly uncomfortable sitting across from Carter in the conference room, sweat beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement, Jacob began, sliding a document across the table. Full return of Mrs. Hammond's inheritance plus an additional $50,000 for emotional distress. Carter didn't even glance at the paper. We're seeking full return of the inheritance, half of all marital assets, including those hidden in the Cayman Islands, and a 25% stake in Phoenix Holdings, which was funded with marital assets. Jacob's face paled. That's completely unreasonable. The Cayman accounts are business-related, not marital assets, and Phoenix Holdings is a separate LLC formed before the inheritance transfer. Formed during the marriage, making it a marital asset, Carter countered smoothly. And the Cayman accounts contain funds diverted from Hammond Construction during the marriage, funds that would have increased the company's value and, by extension, the marital estate. It was fascinating watching Carter work. He was like a chess master, several moves ahead and completely confident in his strategy. My client was transparent about keeping business and personal finances separate, Jacob argued, though his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Hammond agreed to this arrangement. Your client committed perjury, Carter replied, his tone conversational but razor-sharp. He materially misrepresented his assets in sworn statements to the court. That's a felony, Mr. Wilson, as is. Tax evasion, which the IRS tends to take rather seriously. Jacob loosened his tie, clearly uncomfortable. What exactly are you proposing? Carter named a figure that made Jacob's eyes widen. That's outrageous. My client will never agree to that. Then we'll see your client in court, Carter said with a shrug. And we'll be obligated to submit all our evidence, including the Cayman accounts documentation. I wonder how the IRS will react to that information. As we left the meeting, I turned to Carter. Will they really agree to your terms? They'll try to negotiate down, but yes, they'll settle, he said confidently. Kenneth can't afford to let this go to trial. There's too much at stake, not just money, but potential criminal charges. He was right. 2 days later, Jacob returned, with a counteroffer that, while not everything we'd asked for, was substantially more generous than their initial proposal. Full return of your inheritance plus $200,000 in compensatory damages and a 15% stake in Phoenix Holdings, Carter summarized, for me. Plus a non-disclosure agreement. They're quite keen on keeping all of this quiet. I considered the offer. The money would more than restore what I'd lost, and the stake in Phoenix Holdings would provide ongoing income once the development was completed. But something felt unfinished. What about Richard? I asked. Does he know about any of this yet? Carter shook his head. Not to my knowledge. Kenneth has been handling all legal matters personally. I made my decision. I'll accept the financial terms, but I want something added to the agreement. I want a meeting with Richard Hammond, just him and me. No Kenneth, no lawyers. 1 hour before I sign anything. Carter raised an eyebrow. That's an unusual request. May I ask why? I thought about Richard, the man who had built Hammond Construction from nothing, whose integrity in business was widely respected in Denver. A man who had welcomed me into his family, even if his wife and son had seen me as nothing more than a financial opportunity. Because he deserves to know the truth, I said simply. And because I need to look him in the eye and understand if he was part of this or another victim. To my surprise, Kenneth agreed to arrange the meeting. Perhaps he thought I would be easier to manipulate than his father once the truth came out. Perhaps he was hoping to control the narrative somehow. Whatever his reasons, 3 days later, I found myself sitting across from Richard Hammond in a private room at the Denver Athletic Club, where he was a longtime member. He looked older than I remembered, the strain of recent events evident in the new lines on his face. But his handshake was firm as ever, his gaze direct. "Brianna," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I have to say, this is an unusual request. Kenneth says you wanted to speak with me before finalizing the divorce settlement." I nodded, suddenly nervous. What if Richard had been part of the scheme all along? What if my instinct about his character was as flawed as my judgment about Kenneth? But I had come too far to back down now. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. How much do you know about Project Phoenix?" He frowned slightly. "The Aspen development? It's our biggest project to date, set to break ground next month." "Why?" "And how is it being funded?" I pressed. "Bank loans primarily, based on the company's strong performance over the last 5 years. Some private investment from Kenneth and a few others." He studied my face. "Brianna, what is this about?" Taking a deep breath, I slid a folder across the table. Copies of the documents Alexis had uncovered, showing the transfer of my inheritance to Phoenix Holdings, the LLC structure, and the Cayman account statements. "I think you should see these," I said quietly. Richard opened the folder, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something darker as he reviewed the contents. His hands, weathered from decades in construction before he moved to management, trembled slightly as he turned each page. "Is this accurate?" he finally asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Every document has been verified by a forensic accountant," I confirmed. "My inheritance, the money Kenneth told me was needed to save the company from bankruptcy, was transferred directly to this LLC for the Aspen project. The company was never in financial trouble." Richard closed the folder, his jaw clenched. "And these offshore accounts contain nearly $4 million that appears to have been diverted from Hammond Construction over the past 5 years. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the closed folder as if it might bite him. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a mixture of anger and profound sadness. "I had no idea," he said, and I believed him. The shock in his face couldn't be faked. "Brianna, I swear to you, I knew nothing about any of this. The company, my company, has always operated with complete transparency and integrity. At least I thought it did." "I believe you," I said softly. "That's why I wanted to meet with you directly. You deserve to know." Richard ran a hand over his face. "Kenneth has been handling more of the financial operations over the past few years as I've stepped back. I trusted him completely." He gave a bitter laugh. "Just as you did." "What will you do now?" I asked. His expression hardened with resolve. "First, I'm going to verify all of this independently. Then, if it's confirmed, I'll do what I should have done years ago. Take back control of my company and hold my son accountable for his actions." He reached across the table and grasped my hand. "Brianna, I am so sorry. Not just for what Kenneth did to you, but for bringing you into this family at all." I felt tears threatening, but blinked them away. "Not all of the family was bad, Richard. I always valued your kindness." When we parted an hour later, something had shifted. The boulder of betrayal I'd been carrying felt marginally lighter. Richard wasn't responsible for Kenneth's actions, but his acknowledgement, his genuine shock and regret, provided a small measure of validation I hadn't realized I needed. That evening, I called Carter and told him I was ready to sign the settlement agreement. It was time to close this chapter and begin rebuilding my life. What I didn't know then was that Richard Hammond was a man of his word, and that the consequences of our meeting would reverberate far beyond my divorce settlement. I signed the divorce settlement on a Thursday morning in Carter's office. The document that ended my marriage was surprisingly brief considering the complexity of the negotiations behind it. My signature felt both final and freeing, closing one chapter, opening another. "Congratulations," Carter said, shaking my hand. "You're now officially unmarried, considerably wealthier, and the owner of a 15% stake in what promises to be an extremely profitable development." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. The victory was financial, but the emotional cost had been enormous. The person I had loved, built a life with, and trusted completely had never really existed. "What happens now?" I asked. "The funds should be transferred within 48 hours, Carter explained. "Your inheritance plus the additional $200,000 will go directly to your personal account. Hammond Construction's attorneys will send documentation regarding your interest in Phoenix Holdings." I nodded, still processing the reality of my new circumstances. "And Kenneth?" Carter's expression tightened slightly. "He signed the papers yesterday. The non-disclosure agreement works both ways. He can't discuss the terms of the settlement, and neither can you." "That's not what I meant," I said quietly. "What happens to him now?" Carter regarded me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "That's not your problem anymore, Brianna. You've won. He's out of your life. That was the goal, wasn't it?" I wasn't sure how to explain the complicated emotions swirling inside me. It wasn't that I wanted Kenneth back. The betrayal was too complete, too calculated for that. But after 3 years of marriage, the abrupt severance felt unnatural, like a phantom, limb pain. "Of course," I said, gathering my things. "Thank you for everything, Carter." As promised, the funds appeared in my account the next day. Seeing the balance, my inheritance restored plus the additional compensation, should have felt like justice. Instead, it felt like blood money, payment for years of lies. I spent the weekend apartment hunting, determined to move out of Demi's place now that I could afford my own space again. It was time to rebuild, to create a life that was entirely mine. On Monday morning, I walked into Denver Memorial for my shift and immediately sensed something was different. Conversations stopped as I passed. Colleagues gave me awkward smiles. My friend Jacob from the ER practically jumped when he saw me coming. "What's going on?" I asked him, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the strange atmosphere. Jacob hesitated, then pulled me into an empty break room. "You haven't seen the news, have you?" My stomach dropped. "What news?" He pulled out his phone and showed me the headline from the Denver Business Journal. "Hammond Construction CEO arrested on fraud charges. Company in turmoil." The accompanying photo showed Richard Hammond, not Kenneth, being escorted from the Y company headquarters by police officers. "That's not right," I said, snatching the phone to read the article. Richard wasn't involved. It was Kenneth who— I stopped as I scanned the text, my blood running cold. According to the article, Richard Hammond had turned himself in to authorities on Friday, confessing to tax evasion and fraud related to offshore accounts. Kenneth Hammond, newly appointed CEO, expressed shock and disappointment at his father's actions and pledged full cooperation with investigators. "This is wrong," I whispered, handing the phone back to Jacob. "All of it is wrong." "There's more," Jacob said hesitantly. "Everyone's talking about it because, well, Kenneth gave an interview. He mentioned you." "What?" "The settlement had a non-disclosure clause. He didn't discuss the divorce settlement," Jacob clarified. "Just said that his marriage ended partly because of the stress of discovering financial irregularities in the company his father ran. He implied that he was the whistleblower who uncovered everything." The audacity was breathtaking. Kenneth had not only managed to pin his own crimes on his father, but he had also recast himself as the honest son forced to turn in his corrupt father. And somehow, he had dragged me into his narrative. I thought about Richard. Honorable, straightforward. Richard, sitting in a jail cell taking the blame for his son's actions. The injustice of it made me physically ill. I have to go, I told Jacob, already heading for the door. Brianna, wait! Your shift starts in 15 minutes. But I was already gone, pulling out my phone to call Carter as I hurried to my car. I've seen it, he said before I could even explain why I was calling. Kenneth violated the spirit but not the letter of our agreement. He didn't disclose financial terms, just created a narrative that paints him as the victim. But Richard is innocent. Kenneth is the one who created the offshore accounts, who took my money under false pretenses. I believe you, Carter said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. But legally, our hands are tied. The non-disclosure works both ways. If you publicly contradict Kenneth's story, you could be in breach of contract. So I'm just supposed to say nothing while an innocent man goes to jail? Carter, I showed Richard those documents. I'm the reason he discovered what Kenneth was doing. This is partly my fault. It's not your fault that Richard chose to take the blame, Carter argued. We don't know what happened between him and Kenneth after your meeting. Maybe Richard made this choice to protect his son, misguided as that might be. I remembered Richard's words. I'll do what I should have done years ago. Take back control of my company and hold my son accountable for his actions. This didn't align with him confessing to crimes he didn't commit. Something's wrong, I insisted. This doesn't make sense. After hanging up with Carter, I sat in my car, mind racing. I couldn't directly contradict Kenneth's story without violating the non-disclosure agreement. I couldn't contact Richard while he was in custody. I felt powerless, trapped by the very legal agreement that was supposed to give me justice. Then, I remembered. There was one person who might know what had really happened, who wasn't bound by any non-disclosure agreement. Demi, the receptionist at Hammond Construction. The same Demi who had been uncomfortable telling me about Kenneth's business trip with Nicola months ago. I drove to the Hammond Construction headquarters, a modern 4-story building in downtown Denver. The lobby was chaotic. Reporters camped. Outside, employees huddled in worried groups, phones ringing unanswered at the reception desk. I spotted Demi near the elevators, her usually perfect makeup smudged from tears. Demi, I called, pushing past a group of agitated employees. She looked up, recognition and then panic flashing across her face. Brianna, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. I pulled her into an empty conference room off the main lobby, closing the door on the chaos outside. What happened? I demanded. Why is Richard taking the blame for Kenneth's actions? Demi glanced nervously at the door. I can't talk about this. I could lose my job, and with everything happening. Demi, please, I interrupted. Richard is innocent. You must know that. She hesitated, then her shoulders slumped. Of course I know that. Everyone who's worked here more than a year knows that. Richard Hammond is the most honest man I've ever met. Then why is he in jail? Instead of Kenneth? Demi's eyes filled with fresh tears. Friday morning was chaos. Richard called an emergency board meeting. Kenneth wasn't there. He was sick at home. Richard presented evidence of financial irregularities, said he was launching a full investigation. 2 hours later, he was being led out in handcuffs, and we got an email saying Kenneth was taking over as CEO effective immediately. But why? Would Richard confess to crimes he didn't commit? Demi lowered her voice to a whisper. The rumor is that Kenneth threatened him. Threatened him how? I pressed. Richard doesn't seem like a man who would intimidate easily. Not with physical harm, Demi clarified. With Sylvia. Apparently, Kenneth has evidence that Sylvia was involved in the financial schemes. He told Richard either he takes the fall, or both of them go down, and Sylvia would likely face more severe charges because of her direct involvement. The pieces clicked into place. Richard was protecting his wife, just as I had once tried to protect. Her son. Is there any proof of this? I asked. Demi shook her head. Just office gossip. But she hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. Richard asked me to put some files on this Friday morning, before the board meeting. I never got the chance to return it to him. I don't know what's on it, but he was very insistent that it be prepared quickly. I stared at the tiny device. Why are you giving this to me? Because Richard trusted you enough to meet with you privately before all this happened. And because what's happening now isn't right. She pressed the drive into my hand. I don't know if this will help, but it seems important. As I left the building, USB drive secure in my pocket, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. It's about Richard. Meet me at the Oxford Hotel bar. 7 p.m. Jacob Wilson. Kenneth's attorney wanted to meet. This couldn't be a coincidence. I clutched the USB drive tighter, wondering what Richard had put on it, and whether it held the key to unraveling Kenneth's latest deception. The Oxford Hotel was one of Denver's oldest and most elegant establishments. Its bar a wood-paneled sanctuary favored by the city's power players for discreet meetings. I arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. Before heading to the meeting, I had called Carter to let him know about Jacob's text. It's almost certainly a trap, he'd warned. Kenneth likely wants to ensure your silence. Jacob wouldn't reach out unless they're worried about something. The USB drive, I suggested. Maybe Richard put something on it that could expose Kenneth. Possibly. But whatever you do, don't go alone. Public place, witnesses, and someone you trust nearby. So Demi sat at the bar, nursing a gin and tonic, close enough to intervene if needed, but not obviously with me. She had readily agreed to help, her loyalty to Richard Hammond outweighing any concerns about her job security. Jacob Wilson arrived precisely at 7 p.m., looking considerably more disheveled than when I'd seen him in Carter's office. His normally immaculate suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Brianna," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Thank you for coming." "You said this was about Richard," I replied coolly. "I'm listening." Jacob glanced around nervously before leaning forward. "I need to know what Richard told you during your meeting last week. Before his arrest. Why would I tell you anything? You're Kenneth's attorney." "I was Kenneth's attorney," Jacob corrected, emphasis on was. "I resigned this morning." That caught me off guard. "Why?" He signaled the waitress, ordering a Scotch neat with the urgency of a man desperately in need of a drink. Only after it arrived and he'd taken a substantial sip did he continue. "I've known Kenneth since we were kids. When he asked me to handle his divorce, I agreed as a friend. I believed his version of events. That the marriage had simply failed, that you were bitter about using your inheritance to help the family business." He looked genuinely ashamed. "I should have asked more questions." "You were representing your client," I said, surprising myself with the lack of rancor in my voice. "That's your job." "My job isn't to facilitate fraud or obstruct justice," Jacob countered. "After Richard's arrest, Kenneth asked me to handle some adjustments to company records. Said it was to protect the business during this difficult transition." That's when I realized I was being asked to participate in a cover-up. He took another drink, his hand trembling slightly. "I've known Richard Hammond my entire life. He coached my Little League team. He paid for my law school application fees when my parents couldn't afford them. The idea that he would commit financial fraud is laughable to anyone who truly knows him. Yet he confessed," I pointed out. "Yes," Jacob agreed grimly. "The question is why?" I thought about what Demi had told me, that Kenneth was threatening to implicate Sylvia unless Richard took the blame. But I wasn't ready to share that with Jacob. not until I was certain of his motives. "Why come to me?" I asked. "Why not go to the police if you suspect Kenneth is framing his father?" "Because I don't have proof, just suspicions. And because Richard met with you right before everything imploded. He must have told you something important." I considered my options carefully. The non-disclosure agreement prevented me from discussing the divorce settlement, but it didn't explicitly forbid me from sharing what Richard and I had discussed about the company's finances. "Richard didn't know about the offshore accounts until I showed him documentation," I said finally. "He was shocked, angry. He told me he was going to verify the information independently and then hold Kenneth accountable." Jacob nodded, as if this confirmed his suspicions. "That aligns with what happened next. Richard called an emergency board. Meeting Friday morning, mentioned serious financial concerns that required investigation. He didn't name Kenneth specifically, but it was clear he had someone in mind." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. 2 hours later, Richard was in custody, confessing to crimes I'm certain he didn't commit. "You think Kenneth somehow forced his father to take the blame?" "I know Kenneth," Jacob said grimly. "He can be persuasive when cornered, and he'd do anything to protect himself." He hesitated. "There's something else you should know. The board is voting tomorrow on whether to proceed with Project Phoenix under Kenneth's leadership. If they approve, groundbreaking begins next month. Once that happens, the company will be committed. Millions in contracts, loans secured against future profits. It would be much harder to unravel Kenneth's involvement." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "Because you might be the only person who can stop it," Jacob replied. "Richard trusted you with information about the company's finances. If you have anything, any evidence that might clear Richard and implicate Kenneth, now is the time to use it." I thought about the USB drive in my purse, still unexamined. Could it contain the evidence needed to expose Kenneth's latest deception? "If I had such evidence," I said carefully, "using it might violate my non-disclosure agreement with Kenneth." "Not necessarily," Jacob countered. "The NDA covers the terms of your divorce settlement, not evidence of potential criminal activity. There's legal precedent that NDAs can't be used to conceal crimes." He gave me a knowing look. "I'm still a lawyer, Brianna. I know how these agreements work." I weighed my options. Jacob seemed sincere, but trusting anyone connected to Kenneth felt dangerous. Yet doing nothing meant allowing Richard to take the blame for crimes he didn't commit, crimes that Kenneth had used my inheritance to perpetrate. "I may have something," I admitted finally, "but I haven't reviewed it yet. And I'm not sure I can trust you to help without knowing exactly why you're suddenly opposing Kenneth." Jacob's expression hardened. "Kenneth wasn't just my client. He was my friend, or so I thought. When I questioned the ethics of what he was asking me to do regarding the company records, he reminded me that I had helped prepare certain documents for the divorce proceedings, documents that misstated his assets. He implied we were both complicit. He threatened you with disbarment, I realized. Or worse, Jacob confirmed. But unlike Kenneth, I have a line I won't cross. Richard Hammond is a good man who doesn't deserve this. And if helping you means the end of my legal career, he shrugged. So be it. His words rang true, the resignation of a man who had made his choice and accepted the potential consequences. Still, caution was warranted. I need time to examine what I have, I said. If there's something useful, I'll contact you. Jacob nodded, sliding a business card across the table with his personal number written on the back. The board meeting is at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Whatever you decide to do, it needs to happen before then. After Jacob left, Demi joined me at the table. Well? She asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Can we trust him? I'm not sure, I admitted. But I think we need to see what's on this USB drive. We went to Demi's apartment, the closest safe place with a computer. As she booted up her laptop, I felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Whatever Richard had put on this drive, he had prepared it just before confronting the board about financial irregularities, just before his unexpected arrest. The USB drive contained a single password-protected folder labeled Phoenix. After several failed attempts using Hammond construction variations, Demi suggested trying Brianna. The folder opened immediately. He used my name as the password, I whispered, stunned by the implication. Richard had prepared these files for me specifically, anticipating that I might need them. Inside were dozens of documents, financial records, emails, corporate minutes, and a video file labeled Watch First. With trembling fingers, I clicked. On it. Richard's face filled the screen, his expression grave. Brianna, if you're watching this, then things haven't gone as planned. The documents you showed me confirmed what I've suspected for months but couldn't prove. Kenneth has been systematically defrauding the company, diverting funds, and creating shadow operations like Phoenix Holdings. He took a deep breath. I'm confronting the board tomorrow with everything I've found. But Kenneth is cunning, and he has powerful allies, including my wife. His expression clouded with pain. Sylvia has always been blind where Kenneth is concerned, willing to excuse or enable his worst behaviors. I've just discovered she helped him set up the offshore accounts years ago. Richard leaned closer to the camera. I don't know what will happen after tomorrow's meeting, but I wanted to ensure the truth doesn't disappear. Everything you need is in this folder. Proof that Kenneth created the offshore accounts, documentation of how your inheritance was funneled into Phoenix Holdings, and evidence of other financial crimes stretching back 5 years. His final words sent chills down my spine. Be careful, Brianna. Kenneth is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. If something happens to me, take this to Detective Marcus Reyes at the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. He's an old friend and incorruptible. The video ended, leaving Demi and me staring at the screen in stunned silence. He knew, Demi finally whispered. He knew something might happen to him. I nodded, my mind racing. Richard had created a digital insurance policy and entrusted it to me. Now I had to decide how to use it. And quickly, before the board meeting that could cement Kenneth's control of Hammond Construction. I need to call Carter, I said, reaching for my phone. And then we need to find Detective Marcus Reyes. Carter was skeptical when I called him about the USB drive and Richard's video. This is tricky legal territory, he warned. Even if the NDA doesn't explicitly prevent you from reporting criminal activity, Kenneth could argue you're violating the spirit of the agreement. He could sue for the return of the settlement funds. I don't care about the money, I told him, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Richard is in jail for crimes he didn't commit. Kenneth used my inheritance to fund his illegal activities. I can't just do nothing. After a long pause, Carter sighed. I can't advise you to take action that might violate a legal agreement I helped negotiate. But as a human being, I understand why you feel you need to do this. Just be careful and keep me informed. With that ambiguous blessing, Demi and I spent the next 2 hours reviewing the USB contents, astounded by the breadth and detail of Richard's documentation. He had meticulously tracked Kenneth's financial manipulations, compiling evidence of fund diversions, falsified company records, and the true ownership structure of Phoenix Holdings. Most damning was an email thread between Kenneth and Nicola, discussing how to approach me about accessing the inheritance 6 months before Kenneth had claimed the business was in trouble. They had planned the deception long in advance, identifying me as the perfect target because of my lack of family connections and my trust in Kenneth. We need to find Detective Reyes, I said, closing the laptop. Tonight. Locating a specific detective after business hours proved challenging. The Denver Police Department's main line transferred us to financial crimes, where we left a message explaining the urgency. When no one called back after 30 minutes, we decided to go to the station in person. The downtown precinct was quiet. When we arrived, The night desk sergeant regarding us with bored suspicion as I explained we needed to speak with Detective Marcus Reyes about evidence in the Hammond construction fraud case. Reyes is off tonight, the sergeant informed us. You can leave a message or come back tomorrow. This can't wait until tomorrow, I insisted. There's a board meeting at 10 a.m. that could make it impossible to recover stolen funds. Please, can you contact him? Richard Hammond specifically named him. At the mention of Richard's name, the sergeant's expression shifted slightly. Wait here, he said, disappearing into a back office. 10 minutes later, a man emerged, tall, African-American, with salt and pepper hair and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much. He wasn't in uniform, instead wearing jeans and a Denver Broncos sweatshirt, as if he'd been called from home. I'm Detective Reyes, he said, extending his hand. The sergeant says you have information about Richard Hammond? I explained the situation, concisely. My marriage to Kenneth, the fraudulent request for my inheritance, the discovery of the offshore accounts, and finally, Richard's video message and the evidence on the USB drive. Reyes listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim. When I finished, he asked to see the video. We followed him to an interview room where he plugged the USB drive into a department laptop. As Richard's message played, Reyes took notes, occasionally nodding as if confirming something he already suspected. Richard and I go back 30 years, he said when the video ended. He's one of the most honest businessmen I've ever known. When I heard he'd confessed to financial fraud, I knew something wasn't right. Then you believe us? Demi asked hopefully. I believe Richard, Reyes clarified. And his documentation appears comprehensive. But we need to move carefully. Kenneth Hammond has powerful connections in this city, and white-collar crime cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute without airtight evidence. What about Richard? I pressed. He's in jail for crimes he didn't commit. One step at a time, Reyes counseled. First, I need to review all this evidence thoroughly. Then we can discuss next steps, including how to approach the DA about Richard's situation. There isn't time, I argued. The board votes tomorrow morning on Project Phoenix. Once that happens, Kenneth's position is strengthened, and millions more will be tied up in his scheme. Reyes studied me thoughtfully. What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Hammond? Brianna, I corrected automatically. And I'm suggesting we need to stop that board meeting, or at least ensure the board has all the facts before they vote. That's not how police investigations work, Reyes explained patiently. We gather evidence, build a case, then make arrests. We don't interrupt private corporate meetings based on allegations that haven't been fully verified. I felt frustration building. Every minute we spent debating procedure was another minute Richard remained in jail, while Kenneth prepared to consolidate his control. Then what if I go to the board meeting? I suggested. I'm a stakeholder in Phoenix Holdings now, thanks to the divorce settlement. I have a right to address the board about a project I partially own. Reyes frowned. That would be a civilian action, not a police matter. I couldn't be involved officially. But you could expedite your review of the evidence, I pressed. So that if I manage to delay the vote, you might have something more concrete to present. After a moment's consideration, Reyes nodded. I'll review everything immediately. If, and this is a big if, I find sufficient evidence of criminal activity, I can request a meeting with the DA first thing tomorrow. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was a start. Reyes took copies of all the files, promising to work through the night. As Demi and I left the station, I received a text from Jacob. Kenneth called emergency pre-meeting with keyboard members. 8 a.m. tomorrow. Moving fast. Updates? I showed Demi the message. They're accelerating the timeline. We need to be ready by 8 a.m., not 10. What's the plan? She asked as we climbed into my car. I thought about it as I started the engine. I need to talk to the board directly, as a Phoenix Holdings stakeholder. But Kenneth will try to prevent that. We need leverage. something that will force them to listen to me. An idea was forming, risky but potentially effective. Demi, does Hammond Construction have a public relations department? Of course. Nicola heads it, but there's a team of 3 people under her. And how would they handle a major media crisis? Say, if a story broke about potential fraud at the company? Demi's eyes widened as she caught my drift. They'd call an emergency response meeting. All senior leadership, including the board. And would they exclude a stakeholder in the company's biggest current project from such a meeting? They couldn't, Demi confirmed. Not without raising even more red flags. I nodded, plan crystallizing. I need to contact Janet Sullivan at the Denver Business Journal. She covered the story about Richard's arrest, right? Yes, she's their lead business reporter. I pulled over and searched for Janet's contact information online, finding her email on the newspaper's website. I composed a message with the subject line: Exclusive, the truth behind Hammond Construction fraud case. In the body, I was careful not to violate the NDA by discussing my divorce settlement, instead focusing on what I had learned about the company's finances as Kenneth's wife and my concerns about Richard's confession. I hinted at documentation that raises serious questions about who was really responsible for the financial irregularities, and requested a meeting before the board vote tomorrow. I showed the draft to Demi. What do you think? Enough to get her attention without explicitly breaking the NDA? Demi read it carefully. It should work. Janet's ambitious. She won't ignore a potential exclusive that could contradict her earlier reporting. I sent the email, then composed a text to Jacob. Working on intervention for 8 a.m. meeting. Need your help to ensure I'm not blocked from entering. I have evidence that will interest the board. His response came quickly. Will do what I can. Be prepared for resistance. Back at Demi's apartment, we spent hours preparing. I organized the key documents from Richard's USB drive, creating a presentation that clearly demonstrated Kenneth's financial manipulation. Demi helped me craft talking points that would be both concise and devastating. Around 2 a.m., my phone rang. Janet Sullivan from the Business Journal. Mrs. Hammond, I just saw your email. Can you verify any of these claims about Richard Hammond's arrest? I have documentation, I told her, but I can't share it until after tomorrow's board meeting. I wanted to alert you that there may be significant developments in the case. Is this related to your divorce from Kenneth Hammond? She asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. I can't discuss my divorce due to legal agreements, I replied, carefully. My concern is seeing justice done for Richard Hammond, who I believe is innocent of the charges against him. Janet was silent for a moment, clearly weighing my credibility. The board meeting is at 10 a.m. tomorrow? It's been moved to 8 a.m., I corrected. An emergency session before the previously scheduled meeting. I'll have a photographer outside. Hammond Construction headquarters at 7:30, she decided. If you're planning to make an appearance, we want to be there. It wasn't quite the media coverage I'd hoped for, but having a journalist on standby created additional pressure. Kenneth would be aware that any attempt to block me would be documented, potentially creating more negative publicity. As I hung up, exhaustion finally hit me. In less than 6 hours, I would be confronting Kenneth and the board with evidence of his crimes. The same man who had manipulated me, stolen my inheritance, and framed his own father was now my direct adversary in what might be the most important meeting of my life. You should try to sleep, Demi suggested, noting my fatigue. But as I lay on her couch staring at the ceiling, sleep seemed impossible. My mind raced with preparations, contingencies, worst-case scenarios. What if Kenneth somehow prevented me from speaking? What if the board dismissed Richard's evidence? What if Detective Reyes couldn't act quickly enough? Beneath these tactical concerns lay deeper emotions. Anger at Kenneth's betrayal, guilt over my role in Richard's predicament, and a strange sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before my marriage. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I was already awake, reviewing my notes one final time. I dressed carefully in the most professional outfit I could assemble from my limited wardrobe at Demi's apartment. A navy pencil skirt, white blouse, and the one thing I had kept from my marriage. A pair of expensive pearl earrings Kenneth had given me for our first anniversary. "Why those?" Demi asked, noticing the earrings. I touched one reflectively. "To remind me of what I'm fighting for. Not just justice for Richard, but reclaiming pieces of myself that Kenneth tried to take." As we drove toward Hammond Construction headquarters in the pale light of early morning, I felt surprisingly calm. Whatever happened in the next few hours would irrevocably change my life. Again. But this time, I was the one driving the change, not a victim of someone else's deception. "Ready?" Demi asked as we pulled into the parking lot, spotting Janet Sullivan and her photographer already positioned near the entrance. I nodded, gathering my courage and my documents. "Ready." The Hammond Construction lobby was already buzzing with activity when we arrived. Board members in expensive suits clustered in small groups, their conversations hushing momentarily as I walked through the door. Several executives I recognized from company events during my marriage did double takes, clearly shocked to see me. A few quickly averted their eyes, embarrassed perhaps by their association with Kenneth, or uncertain how to acknowledge the ex-wife who had been so suddenly discarded. Jacob. Wilson waited near the reception desk, his posture tense but resolute. Relief washed over his face when he spotted me making my way through the crowded lobby. "You made it?" he said, stepping forward to greet me. "I wasn't sure if you'd go through with it. Kenneth's been working the room since 7 a.m. trying to limit attendance to board members only. I had to remind them that as a stakeholder in Phoenix Holdings, you have standing to address any meeting concerning the project." "Is he here yet?" I asked, clutching my portfolio of documents so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Despite my outward composure, my heart was racing, and I could feel a slight tremor in my hands. Upstairs with Nicola, preparing his presentation. "He doesn't know you're coming." Jacob lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "The mood is tense. Several board members have questions about Richard's arrest that Kenneth hasn't adequately addressed. There are rumors some of the company's major clients are considering pulling their contracts until the legal situation is clarified." That was promising. Cracks in Kenneth's narrative that I could exploit. If board members were already harboring doubts, they might be more receptive to the evidence I was about to present. "What about Sylvia?" I asked, scanning the room for my former mother-in-law's perfectly coiffed silver hair. "She's here. Arrived early, been speaking privately with some of the older board members, Parker, Westfield, and Martinez. I think she's trying to shore up support for Kenneth. Those three have known the family for decades." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an older man I recognized as Robert Calloway, the board's chairman. Tall and imposing, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, he'd been Richard's friend since college and had always treated me kindly at company functions. His expression was guarded as he approached us, his gaze evaluating me with new interest. "Mrs. Hammond," he said, extending his hand. "Jacob tells me you have information relevant to today's vote on Project Phoenix." "I do, Mr. Calloway. Information the board needs to hear before making any decisions about the project or the company's future." I met his gaze directly, determined to project confidence despite my inner turmoil. He studied me carefully, clearly weighing his options. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the risk of derailing the meeting's agenda versus the potential liability of ignoring relevant information from a stakeholder. "We're under considerable time pressure this morning, with Richard's legal situation creating complications. The board has serious concerns about moving forward with such a significant investment during this period of uncertainty. My information directly relates to those complications," I replied, maintaining steady eye contact, "and to the true financial status of both Hammond Construction and Phoenix Holdings." A flash of curiosity crossed his face, followed by a barely perceptible nod of decision. Very well. You'll have 10 minutes at the start of the meeting. I suggest you use them wisely. The future of this company may depend on it. As he walked away, Jacob gave me an encouraging nod. That's better than I expected. Callaway rarely deviates from the agenda, especially for controversial matters. 10 minutes is all I need, I assured him, though my heart was racing. Once they see what's on this drive, they'll want to hear more. We took the elevator to the fourth-floor conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see board members taking their seats around a massive oak table that dominated the room. Some were engaged in hushed conversations, their expressions serious. Others reviewed documents from leather portfolios, occasionally glancing up as new people entered. Kenneth stood at the head of the table, arranging presentation materials with the confident efficiency I'd once admired. He wore his power suit, charcoal, gray with subtle pinstripes, tailored perfectly to his athletic frame. Nicholas stood beside him in a sleek navy dress, pointing at something on his tablet screen. They looked like the perfect corporate power couple, polished and in command. Ready? Jacob asked quietly as the elevator doors opened. I took a deep breath, thinking of Richard sitting in a jail cell for crimes he didn't commit. I thought of the emails I'd read between Kenneth and Nicola, plotting to access my inheritance months before he'd claimed the business was in trouble. I thought of Sylvia's cruel text. We always knew you weren't right for him. Ready? I replied, straightening my shoulders and lifting my chin. As we entered the room, Kenneth looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm to cold composure in the span of seconds. It was fascinating to watch the micro-expressions flash across his face, the slight widening of his eyes in shock, the momentary tightening of his jaw in panic, and then the rapid reassembly of his corporate mask. Brianna, he said, his tone professionally cordial, though his eyes were hard as granite. This is a surprise. The board meeting is closed to non-members. Mrs. Hammond has been granted speaking time as a Phoenix Holdings stakeholder, Chairman Callaway announced, taking his seat at the opposite end of the table from Kenneth. She has information pertinent to our discussions. Kenneth's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his corporate smile. I recognized that smile. It was the same one he'd worn when convincing me to transfer my inheritance, a blend of confidence and calculated charm. Of course, always happy to hear from our stakeholders. The slight pause before the final word was deliberate, a subtle reminder to everyone present that I was an outsider. I felt Nicola's glare as I took the visitor's seat at the far end of the table, directly opposite Kenneth. Her perfectly made-up face couldn't quite hide her hostility. Sylvia Hammond sat midway down the table, her cream-colored St. John knit suit and multi-strand pearl necklace projecting tasteful affluence. Her perfectly coiffed appearance betrayed no emotion beyond mild surprise at my presence. Before we begin, Kenneth said smoothly, assuming control of the room with practiced ease, I should remind everyone that my ex-wife signed a confidentiality agreement regarding our divorce settlement. Any discussion of those private matters would be inappropriate and potentially actionable. Classic Kenneth, trying to control the narrative before I'd spoken a word. It was the same tactic he'd used throughout our marriage, setting parameters for acceptable discussion, subtly warning of consequences for stepping outside those boundaries. I'm not here to discuss my divorce, I replied calmly, connecting Richard's USB drive to the presentation system. I'm here to address serious concerns about Hammond Construction's financial integrity and the true nature of Project Phoenix. Kenneth's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Project Phoenix, but he maintained his composed expression. Sylvia, however, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers reflexively touching her pearl necklace, a nervous habit I'd noticed during tense family discussions. Chairman Callaway checked his watch. You have 10 minutes, Mrs. Hammond. Please proceed. I felt all eyes on me as I pulled up the video file. The weight of the moment was dizzying. 12 board members, several company executives, Kenneth, Nicola, and Sylvia, all watching intently. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if they didn't believe me? What if Kenneth had some counter-argument prepared? What if I was making a terrible mistake? Then I remembered Richard's words from his video. Be careful, Brianna. Kenneth is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. Richard had risked everything to prepare this evidence, knowing what might happen to him. I owed it to him to see this through. Before I show you specific documentation, I'd like you to hear directly from Richard Hammond. Kenneth stepped forward, his composure slipping slightly. This is highly irregular. Richard is currently in custody and cannot— Mr. Hammond, please allow Mrs. Hammond her allotted time, Calloway interrupted, his authoritative tone brooking no argument. We agreed to hear her out. I pressed play, and Richard's face appeared on the large screen. The room fell into stunned silence as he methodically explained his discoveries about Kenneth's financial manipulations, the offshore accounts, and the true purpose of Project Phoenix. When he mentioned Sylvia's involvement, I heard audible gasps from some board members. One elderly gentleman removed his glasses in shock, staring at Sylvia, who had gone deathly pale. As the video ended, I moved quickly through the key documents, the transfer of my inheritance to Phoenix Holdings, the emails between Kenneth and Nicola discussing how to manipulate me, the falsified company records, and the Cayman Island accounts. What you're seeing is evidence that Kenneth Hammond, not Richard, created these fraudulent financial structures. Richard discovered this deception shortly before his arrest and prepared this documentation to ensure the truth wouldn't be buried. Kenneth's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. A sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead, and his breathing had become noticeably faster. Nicola stood frozen beside him, her eyes darting between the screen and the exit door. These are serious allegations with no context, Kenneth said, attempting to regain control. His voice, usually smooth and confident, had an edge of desperation. My father's mental health has been declining for months. That's a lie, I interrupted, my voice stronger than I expected. Richard Hammond is of perfectly sound mind, as his meticulous documentation demonstrates. Are you suggesting he fabricated all of these documents, emails, and financial records? That he somehow created fake offshore accounts in your name? Kenneth flinched slightly at the direct challenge. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed at a loss for words. I turned to the board members, making eye contact with each one as I continued. The question you should be asking is why Richard would suddenly confess to crimes that benefited his son financially, crimes he had just discovered and was preparing to expose. Sylvia Hammond stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Her perfectly composed socialite mask had slipped, revealing the angry, frightened woman beneath. "This is outrageous!" she exclaimed, her voice shrill. "You have no right to come here and slander my son after everything our family has done for you." "Including stealing my inheritance under false pretenses?" I countered, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Using my money to fund Project Phoenix while lying about the company's financial health?" "You gave that money willingly," Sylvia snapped, "to save the family business." "A business that was never in financial trouble," I replied, pulling up the company's actual financial statements from Richard's files. According to these records, Hammond Construction's actual records, the company has been consistently profitable for the past 5 years. The financial crisis Kenneth described to me was entirely fabricated. The room erupted in overlapping conversations as board members began questioning each other and demanding explanations from Kenneth. Some were examining the financial documents on their tablets, comparing them to previous reports they'd received. Others were engaged in heated whispers, occasionally glancing accusingly toward Kenneth and Sylvia. Chairman Calloway banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "One at a time, please. We need to address these allegations systematically. In the chaos, I noticed Kenneth edging toward the door, whispering something urgently to Nicola. They were planning to leave before things deteriorated further. Nicola nodded, subtly gathering her belongings while everyone's attention was focused on the commotion. I raised my voice to be heard above the din. Detective Marcus Reyes of the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit has copies of all these documents. He's meeting with the district attorney this morning to discuss potential charges. That stopped Kenneth in his tracks. His face drained of color as he realized the extent of his exposure. This wasn't just about losing control of the company anymore. He was facing potential criminal charges, and the police were already involved. These offshore accounts, one board member said, looking directly at Kenneth, they were never disclosed in any financial reports to this board. How long have they existed? Kenneth straightened his tie, visibly struggling to regain his composure. These are complex financial matters that require context. If you'll allow me to explain, the documents show transfers dating back 5 years. Another board member interrupted, examining the files on his tablet. That predates your official appointment as CFO. Were you operating these accounts without board approval while your father was still CEO? Chairman Calloway finally restored order. In light of these serious allegations, I'm calling for an immediate suspension of the vote on Project Phoenix and the formation of an independent committee to verify this information. He fixed Kenneth with a stern gaze. Mr. Hammond, you will make yourself available to this committee and provide complete access to all financial records. Kenneth's carefully constructed world was unraveling before my eyes. As board members peppered him with questions he couldn't answer, his confident facade crumbled completely. Nicola had backed away from him slightly, already creating distance between herself and the growing scandal. And then, the conference room door opened. Detective Reyes entered, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. His timing couldn't have been more dramatic if it had been scripted. The room fell silent as he surveyed the scene, his experienced gaze taking in the presentation still displayed on the screen, the agitated board members, and Kenneth's visible distress. Kenneth Hammond? Reyes announced formally, his deep voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room. I need you to come with me to answer some questions regarding financial irregularities at Hammond Construction and the circumstances surrounding Richard Hammond's confession. As the officers approached Kenneth, his eyes locked with mine across the conference room. In that moment, I saw something I'd never witnessed before in my husband's expression. Fear. Not just concern or worry, but genuine fear. For the first time in our relationship, Kenneth Hammond wasn't in control of the situation, and he knew it. The man who had manipulated me, stolen my inheritance, and abandoned me without a backward glance was finally facing consequences. As the officers escorted him from the room, with Nicola being asked to follow separately, I felt no triumph, no vindictive satisfaction, only a profound sense of justice finally being set in motion. After Kenneth was gone, Chairman Calloway approached. Me, his expression a mixture of shock and grudging respect. Mrs. Hammond, he said quietly, I believe the board owes you its gratitude. This could have destroyed the company. I didn't do it for the company, I replied honestly. I did it for Richard. He deserves better than to take the blame for crimes he didn't commit. Calloway nodded thoughtfully. Indeed he does. And Hammond? Construction deserves better leadership than it's had recently. He glanced at the documents still displayed on the screen. We have a lot of work ahead of us. As I gathered my things to leave, several board members approached to thank me or ask questions about the evidence I'd presented. Others huddled in small groups, already discussing next steps and damage control. Sylvia sat alone at the table, abandoned by her son, and now facing her own potential legal troubles. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Walking out of Hammond Construction that morning, I felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of betrayal I'd been carrying had finally begun to lift. Kenneth's crimes had been exposed, Richard would hopefully be cleared, and I had played a central role in making it happen. It wasn't over. There would be investigations, legal proceedings, perhaps even a trial. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer just a victim of Kenneth's manipulation. I was an active agent in bringing him to justice. That knowledge, more than anything else, gave me the strength to face whatever came next. Kenneth's questioning by Detective Reyes lasted for hours. As he was escorted from the boardroom, Nicola attempted to follow, only to be stopped by a second detective who requested she also come in for questioning. The board meeting was officially adjourned, with Chairman Calloway announcing an emergency session for the following day to address the leadership crisis. I remained in the conference room as board members filtered out, many nodding respectfully, in my direction. Jacob stayed by my side, fielding questions from those seeking clarification on the legal implications of what they'd witnessed. Sylvia was the last to leave, her perfect composure finally cracking. She paused at the door, turning to face me with eyes full of venom. "You've destroyed this family," she hissed. "I hope you're satisfied." "Your son destroyed this family when he decided to commit fraud," I replied calmly. "And you helped him when? You chose to hide his crimes instead of holding him accountable." Her face contorted with anger, but before she could respond, a uniformed officer approached. "Mrs. Hammond? Detective Reyes would like to speak with you when you have a moment." Sylvia paled visibly. "Are you arresting me too?" The officer maintained a professional neutrality. "I'm just here to escort Mrs. Hammond to Detective Reyes." As Sylvia hurried away, Jacob squeezed my shoulder supportively. "You did the right thing, Brianna. I know it doesn't feel like a victory right now, but Richard would be proud." Richard. With everything that had happened, I hadn't had time to think about what this meant for him. Would the evidence be enough to secure his release? Detective Reyes was waiting in a small office that had been converted into a temporary interview room. He looked tired, but satisfied. "That was quite a presentation," he said, as I took a seat across from him. "The board members we've interviewed so far corroborate that they had no knowledge of the offshore accounts or the true ownership structure of Phoenix Holdings." "What about Kenneth?" I asked. "Is he cooperating?" Reyes gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not exactly. He's demanding his lawyer, not Jacob Wilson, but a high-priced criminal defense attorney from downtown. Claims everything was his father's idea, and he was just following Richard's instructions." "That contradicts all the evidence on the USB drive," I pointed out. "Yes, and that evidence is proving invaluable. We've already obtained warrants for the Cayman accounts based on Richard's documentation. But the legal process takes time, which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've spoken with the district attorney. Based on the evidence you provided and inconsistencies in Richard's confession, we're requesting an emergency hearing to review his detention, but we need your formal statement as soon as possible." "Of course," I agreed immediately. "Whatever you need." "It won't be easy," Reyes warned. "Richard confessed, which means the burden is on us to prove he did so under duress or false pretenses. Kenneth is already claiming the USB drive was fabricated by Richard to frame him. But the evidence is clear," I argued. "The transfers from my account, the emails between Kenneth and Nicola, those can all be verified independently." "And they will be," Reyes assured me. "The financial transactions are particularly damning. But legal proceedings move slowly, and Kenneth has resources. He'll fight this every step of the way." After giving my formal statement, I found Demi waiting in the lobby. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. "It's going to be a long battle, isn't it?" she asked as we walked to my car. "Yes," I admitted. "But at least the truth is out now. The board knows what Kenneth did, and the police have the evidence they need to investigate properly. And Richard? They're requesting an emergency hearing, but there's no guarantee he'll be released immediately." As I drove back to Demi's apartment, exhaustion finally caught up with me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the board meeting was fading, leaving me drained and suddenly uncertain. I had done what I set out to do, exposed Kenneth's fraud and provided evidence that might help Richard. But the cost had been high. My divorce settlement was almost certainly in jeopardy now, and I had made powerful enemies in Kenneth and Sylvia. "You should get some rest," Demi suggested as we entered her apartment. "You've done everything you can for now." I nodded, too tired to argue, and collapsed onto the couch that had been my bed for the past months. But despite my exhaustion, sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the events of the day: Kenneth's face as Detective Reyes entered the boardroom, Sylvia's furious accusation, the board members' shocked expressions as they viewed Richard's evidence. My phone rang around 9 p.m., an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Brianna, it's Robert Calloway." The board chairman's call surprised me. "Mr. Calloway, what can I do for you?" "I wanted to thank you for what you did today," he said, his voice grave. "The board has spent the afternoon in emergency sessions with our legal team. The evidence you provided, it's even worse than what you showed us this morning. Kenneth has been systematically bleeding the company for years." "I'm sorry," I said, unsure how to respond to his gratitude. "Hammond Construction is a good company. It doesn't deserve to be damaged by Kenneth's actions." "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "Which brings me to the reason for my call. The board has voted unanimously to remove Kenneth as CEO, effective immediately. We're implementing a temporary leadership structure until Richard's situation is resolved." "That's good news," I said, genuinely relieved for the company's employees who depended on its stability. "There's more," Calloway continued. "Given your stake in Phoenix Holdings and your obvious commitment to the company's integrity, we'd like to offer you a position on our advisory committee for project oversight. Your financial background as a clinic administrator would be valuable, especially as we restructure after this crisis." The offer caught me completely off guard. "Mr. Calloway, I'm flattered, but I'm a nurse, not a business executive. A nurse who uncovered financial fraud that our entire board missed," he countered. "Someone who was willing to risk her own financial security to expose the truth. That's exactly the kind of integrity Hammond Construction needs right now." I promised to consider his offer, though it seemed surreal. From Kenneth's discarded wife to a company advisor in the span of a single day. As I hung up, my phone immediately rang again. This time it was Detective Reyes. "Brianna, I thought you'd want to know. The judge has granted our emergency hearing for Richard tomorrow morning. If all goes well, he could be released by noon." For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to feel genuine hope. The path to justice was opening, one step at a time. Richard Hammond's release hearing was standing room only. The courtroom, normally reserved for routine procedural matters, was packed with reporters, Hammond Construction employees, and curious members of the public drawn by the sensational story. I arrived early with Jacob Wilson, securing seats in the second row directly behind where Richard would sit. "Nervous?" Jacob asked, noting how I kept smoothing my skirt with trembling hands. "Terrified," I admitted. What if the judge doesn't believe the evidence? What if Kenneth's influence somehow extends to the court system? Jacob shook his head confidently. "The evidence is too strong, and Judge Watkins is known for her integrity. She can't be bought or influenced." News of the dramatic confrontation at Hammond Construction had spread quickly, with local media outlets covering what they called the Hammond Dynasty scandal. The Denver Post had run a front-page story titled "Family Empire Built on Fraud," while local TV stations featured the image of Kenneth being escorted from company headquarters by police. Janet Sullivan from the Denver Business Journal sat in the front row, having published a detailed account of Kenneth's fraud and my role in exposing it. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Elena Watkins entered the courtroom. A small, severe-looking woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, she commanded immediate respect. "Be seated," she instructed, surveying the crowded courtroom with mild disapproval. "I remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a theatrical performance. Any disruptions will result in immediate removal." Richard was led in by a court officer. He looked thinner than I remembered, the week in jail having taken a visible toll. His usually immaculate appearance was diminished by the standard-issue orange jumpsuit, but he carried himself with dignity, nodding slightly to me as he passed. Sat beside Jacob Wilson, watching as the district attorney presented Richard's case to the judge. The evidence was compelling. The USB drive contents, the suspicious timing of Richard's confession immediately after discovering Kenneth's fraud, and most damning, the testimony of a prison guard who had overheard Kenneth threatening his father during a visit the day after his arrest. "If you recant your confession, Mom goes down too. Is that what you want?" Kenneth had reportedly said, unaware that the guard was within earshot. The district attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Clarissa Martinez, presented the case methodically. "Your Honor, the evidence strongly suggests Mr. Richard Hammond's confession was coerced through threats against his wife. Furthermore, the financial documentation recovered from his office computer clearly indicates the offshore accounts in question were established and managed by Kenneth Hammond, not Richard Hammond." Kenneth's attorney, a polished man from one of Denver's most prestigious law firms, argued that Richard's confession should stand. "Your Honor, regardless of new evidence that may have emerged, Mr. Richard Hammond freely confessed to these crimes. The defense suggests that any claims of coercion are merely attempts to shift blame now that Mr. Hammond regrets his confession." The judge listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Richard, who sat quietly at the defendant's table. Her expression revealed nothing as she reviewed the documents presented by both sides. When all evidence had been presented, she took only 15 minutes to reach her decision, an unusually short deliberation that suggested the evidence was more convincing than Kenneth's attorney had anticipated. Based on the substantial evidence suggesting Mr. Hammond's confession was coerced and that he may have been framed for crimes committed by others, Judge Watkins announced, her clear voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "I am ordering his immediate release pending further investigation. All charges are suspended until the district attorney's office completes its review of the new evidence." The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel and stern glare. "This is still a courtroom," she reminded everyone, sharply. As Richard stood, legally free for the first time in a week, our eyes met across the courtroom. He gave me a small nod of profound gratitude, a gesture more meaningful than any words could have been. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around us, shouting questions and thrusting microphones forward. Richard, looking exhausted but relieved, raised his hands for quiet. "I want to thank the Denver Police Department, particularly Detective Reyes, for their diligence in uncovering the truth. And I want to express my deepest gratitude to Brianna Hammond, whose courage and integrity made this day possible." He turned to me, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me when even my own family didn't," a reporter shouted. From the back of the crowd, "Mr. Hammond, will you be resuming control of Hammond Construction?" Richard shook his head. "Those decisions will need to be made by the board of directors. For now, I'm focused on clearing my name completely and assisting the investigation in any way I can." "Mrs. Hammond," called another reporter, pushing to the front, "how does it feel to be responsible for exposing your ex-husband's crimes?" I hesitated, aware that my answer would likely appear in tomorrow's headlines. "This isn't about exposing Kenneth," I said carefully. "It's about ensuring justice for Richard Hammond, who was willing to sacrifice himself to protect his family, even when they didn't deserve that protection." Walking down the courthouse steps beside Richard, I felt a strange sense of closure. The man who had unwittingly introduced me to his manipulative son was now free because of me. Life had come full circle in ways I never could have imagined. As the weeks passed, the legal proceedings against Kenneth, Nicola, and eventually Sylvia moved forward methodically. Kenneth remained free on bail, his travel restricted, and his passport surrendered while awaiting trial on multiple charges of fraud, tax evasion, and witness tampering. The transformation in his appearance was remarkable. Gone was the confident executive in custom suits, replaced by a haggard man in off-the-rack clothing who avoided eye contact with photographers outside the courthouse. Nicola, facing lesser charges as an accomplice, had turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. Her testimony provided even more damning details about the scheme, including how Kenneth had specifically targeted me for my inheritance months before claiming the business was in trouble. He said she was perfect, Nicola had reportedly told prosecutors. No family to ask questions, completely trusting, and financially naive despite her intelligence. Sylvia, despite her initial denials, was eventually charged with aiding in the concealment of fraudulent activities. Her social standing in Denver had collapsed overnight, with charity boards quietly asking for her resignation and former friends suddenly finding their calendars too full for lunch dates. Meanwhile, Richard had returned to Hammond Construction as interim CEO while the company worked to stabilize after the scandal. The board had unanimously voted to reinstate him, recognizing that his leadership was crucial to restoring client and investor confidence. True to his word, he had officially appointed me to the advisory committee for Phoenix Holdings, which was being restructured as a transparent company subsidiary rather than a separate LLC. My 15% stake remained intact, but now I had a voice in how the project would proceed. My divorce settlement remained intact as well. Kenneth's attorney had attempted to challenge it, claiming I had violated the non-disclosure agreement, but the court had sided with me, ruling that reporting criminal activity was exempt from such restrictions. The judge had been particularly scathing in his opinion, noting that confidentiality agreements cannot be used as shields for criminal behavior. I had moved into my own apartment in a quiet neighborhood near the hospital, using part of the settlement to create a comfortable home that reflected my own taste rather than Kenneth's. Preferred minimalist aesthetic. Bright colors, comfortable furniture, books everywhere, choices that were entirely mine. On my first night in the new apartment, I'd stood in the center of the living room, taking in the space that was entirely my own, free from memories of Kenneth or reminders of my marriage. For the first time in months, I'd felt truly at peace. Guy. Nursing colleagues had welcomed me back warmly, impressed rather than pitying after the news stories about my role in exposing Kenneth's fraud. Patients occasionally recognized me. "Aren't you the nurse who caught that businessman?" But mostly, life at Denver Memorial had returned to normal. One evening, as I reviewed financial projections for the restructured Phoenix project, my phone rang. It was Richard. "Brianna, I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to discuss something with you, if you have a moment." "Of course, Richard. What's on your mind?" I put aside the projections, curious about why he was calling so late. "I've been thinking about what comes next for Hammond Construction. The company needs to rebuild its reputation, focus on ethical practices and transparency. But most importantly, we need to make amends for the harm Kenneth caused, not just to you, but to the community." "Amends how?" I asked, curious where he was going with this. "I've been reviewing your background more thoroughly. Your nursing career, your dream of opening a pediatric clinic, the one you sacrificed your inheritance for, believing you were helping save our family business." His voice held a note of genuine regret. "I'd like to propose a company initiative. Hammond Construction would build a new medical center in an underserved neighborhood with a dedicated pediatric wing. We'd fund it partially through company profits and partially through the recovery of funds from Kenneth's offshore accounts." I was speechless, my forgotten dream suddenly resurfacing as a real possibility. "And," Richard continued into my silence, "I'd like you to oversee the project, both the construction phase and the operational planning. Your medical background combined with your newly demonstrated business acumen makes you uniquely qualified. Richard, I don't know what to say. This is incredibly generous, but are you sure the board would approve such a project? After everything that's happened, shouldn't the company be focusing on stabilizing its core business? The board has already approved it unanimously, Richard replied, a smile evident in his voice. They see it as both the right thing to do ethically and a smart business decision to rebuild our community standing. Corporate social responsibility isn't just a buzzword, Brianna. It's how companies survive scandals. The opportunity was unexpected, but perfect. A chance to use both my nursing expertise and the business skills I'd developed through this ordeal. It wasn't just financial restitution, it was a chance to create something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal. Richard, yes, I'd be honored. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in research, sketching out initial plans for what the medical center might include. I consulted with colleagues at Denver Memorial about the most pressing healthcare needs in underserved communities, compiled statistics on pediatric care access across different Denver neighborhoods, and began identifying potential locations. When I presented my preliminary ideas to Richard and the Hammond Construction Board the following week, the response was overwhelmingly positive. What had started as a restitution project had evolved into something the entire company could rally behind. A concrete demonstration of their commitment to rebuilding not just their reputation, but their relationship with the community. As the meeting concluded, Chairman Calloway pulled me aside. You know, Mrs. Hammond, Brianna, when you first came to us with those documents about Kenneth, I thought you were just seeking revenge. I've rarely been so pleased to be wrong about someone. His words stayed with me as I drove home that evening. 6 months ago, I had been broken, betrayed, and nearly penniless, sleeping on Demi's couch and picking up extra shifts just to pay my attorney. Now I was directing a multi-million-dollar community health project, serving on an advisory committee for a major real estate development, and building a new life entirely on my own terms. The transformation wasn't just in my circumstances, but in myself. The woman who had once defined herself primarily as Kenneth Hammond's wife now stood confidently on her own achievements. The nurse who had set aside her dream of opening a clinic to support her husband's family business was now creating something far more impactful than she had originally imagined. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my old mentor from nursing school, Dr. Elaine Mitchell, who now served as Chief of Pediatrics at Denver Memorial. When I told her about the Community Health Center project, her excitement was palpable. Brianna, this is exactly what you were meant to do, she said warmly. I always knew you had potential beyond bedside nursing, though you're excellent at that too. This project could transform healthcare access for thousands of families. Would you consider being a consultant on the pediatric wing design? I asked hesitantly. Your expertise would be invaluable. I'd be honored, she replied without hesitation. And I know several colleagues who would jump at the chance to be involved as well. When can we start? As I hung up, I felt a surge of genuine excitement for the future. Not the nervous anticipation of waiting for justice to be served, but true enthusiasm for creating something meaningful. The pediatric clinic I had once dreamed of opening with my inheritance would have helped many children. But this community health center could reach thousands of underserved families, creating a lasting impact far beyond what I had originally envisioned. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be zoning challenges, budget constraints, staffing considerations, and countless other obstacles to overcome. But for the first time since Kenneth's betrayal, I felt completely certain of my direction and purpose. My phone buzzed with a text message from Demi. Just saw the news about the Community Health Center project. So proud of you. From surviving to thriving, that's the Brianna I know. Her words brought unexpected tears to my eyes. From surviving to thriving. Yes, that was exactly it. Kenneth had meant to destroy me, but instead, he had inadvertently set me on a path to becoming stronger and more purposeful than I had ever been before. The irony wasn't lost on me. Had Kenneth never betrayed me? Had he been the loving husband I thought he was, I might have spent my life in his shadow, my own dreams perpetually deferred in service to his ambitions and his family's needs. His cruelty, intended to break me, had instead broken the chains I hadn't even realized were binding me. As I reviewed the preliminary sketches for the Denver Community Health Center that night, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in a very long time: pride. Not pride in being chosen or validated by someone else, but pride in my own resilience, my own capabilities, my own vision for making a difference. The clinic wasn't just a building project or a career opportunity. It was tangible proof that sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the most unexpected blessings. Kenneth had taken my inheritance, but in doing so, he had inadvertently given me something far more valuable: the chance to discover just how strong I truly was. The Denver Community Health Center broke ground 6 months later on a crisp autumn morning. The location we'd chosen was significant: a vacant lot in a historically underserved neighborhood that had once been promised a medical facility by the city, only to have funding diverted to more affluent areas. Hammond Construction's distinctive yellow excavators stood ready against the backdrop of downtown Denver's skyline, a visual reminder of the connection between corporate responsibility and community needs. As project director, I stood slightly apart from the assembled crowd, taking in the moment. City officials, healthcare professionals, community leaders, and media representatives had gathered for the ceremonial first shovel of dirt. Richard Hammond stood center stage in his capacity as CEO, flanked by the mayor and representatives from local healthcare advocacy groups. "Today marks more than just the beginning of construction on a building," Richard was saying, his resonant voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "It represents Hammond Construction's renewed commitment to this community and to the principles of integrity, transparency, and genuine social responsibility." The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. The facility, designed to provide affordable care to families regardless of insurance status, with a special focus on pediatric services, had faced numerous obstacles: zoning challenges, budget constraints, and resistance from some established healthcare providers concerned about competition had all threatened to derail the project at various points. But for each problem that arose, solutions emerged, often from unexpected sources. When zoning issues threatened to delay construction, community members had packed city council meetings, sharing powerful stories about traveling across town with sick children because no medical facilities existed in their neighborhood. When budget projections showed a shortfall for specialized pediatric equipment, 3 local foundations had stepped forward with matching grants. As project director, I worked closely with community leaders, healthcare professionals, and Hammond Construction to ensure the center would truly meet local needs. Weekly planning meetings with neighborhood representatives had transformed the original concept into something far more comprehensive. Not just a medical facility, but a true community health hub with nutrition classes, preventive care programs, and mental health services. What began as a building project evolved into something much more profound as I immersed myself in the community. I spent hours in neighborhood association meetings, visited local schools to discuss children's health needs, and hosted focus groups with families to understand their healthcare challenges. In the process, I formed connections that went far. Beyond professional networking, I was becoming part of the community I hoped to serve. It was during these community feedback sessions that I met dozens of women with stories that resonated with my own, women who had survived financial abuse, manipulation, and gaslighting by partners they trusted. Their resilience inspired me, but so did their ongoing vulnerability. Many remained financially dependent on their abusers because they lacked the resources or knowledge to escape. Lucia, a soft-spoken mother of 3, had tearfully described how her husband controlled every aspect of their finances, providing an allowance for household expenses, but requiring receipts for every purchase. She had a nursing degree from her home country but couldn't practice in the U.S. without additional certifications her husband refused to fund despite their comfortable income. "I stay because of my children," she had confided after a community meeting. "Without money, without a job, where would we go? How would I feed them?" He reminds me of this every time I disagree with him. Tamara, a stylish woman in her 50s who volunteered at our community meetings, had lost a successful career and her retirement savings to a husband who had convinced her to invest everything in his business ventures, only to discover he had been funneling the money to support a second family in another state. "I was an accountant for 20 years, she told me, the irony not lost on either of us. "I should have seen the signs, should have insisted on more transparency. But when you trust someone completely, you stop asking the questions you should." Then there was Darlene, barely 25, who had escaped an abusive relationship only to find herself struggling with crushing debt her partner had accumulated in her name through credit cards she hadn't known existed. "The physical bruises heal," she said quietly during a focus group about healthcare barriers. "But the financial damage follows you for years. I can't even rent an apartment on my own because my credit is destroyed." One evening after a particularly emotional community meeting, Demi found me sitting alone in the project trailer, deeply troubled by these conversations that kept replaying in my mind. "What is it?" she asked, taking the seat beside me. "You've been quiet all evening." These women's stories, they're so similar to mine, but most don't have the resources I had. Carter's legal expertise, Richard's support, a forensic accountant. They're stuck in cycles they can't break because they don't know how. Demi studied me thoughtfully. "So what are you going to do about it?" Her simple question crystallized the nebulous thoughts that had been forming in my mind for weeks. "I'm going to help them," I said with sudden certainty. "Not just with health care, but with the tools to recognize and escape financial abuse." That night, I stayed up until dawn outlining a program that would address the specific needs I'd identified through these women's stories. By morning, I had drafted a comprehensive proposal for an additional component to the Denver Community Health Center, the Financial Empowerment Program for Women. The initiative would offer free workshops on financial literacy, legal aid clinics, focused on family law, credit repair assistance, and support groups for survivors of financial abuse. It would provide childcare during all programs, removing a critical barrier that kept many women from seeking help. Most importantly, it would create a safe space where women could learn to recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation before they became trapped. I presented the proposal to Richard and the Hammond Construction Board the following week, expecting resistance. Adding this component would require additional funding beyond the already substantial investment in the health center itself. This wasn't part of the original plan, one board member pointed out after my presentation. "How does a financial education program fit with a medical facility?" "Financial health and physical health are interconnected," I explained. "Women experiencing financial abuse often delay medical care for themselves and their children because they lack control over household resources. By addressing both issues simultaneously, we create a more effective intervention model." I shared anonymous versions of the stories I'd heard, highlighting the health consequences of financial dependency: untreated chronic conditions, delayed pediatric care, mental health impacts including depression and anxiety. "Think of it as preventive care," I concluded. "Just as we vaccinate to prevent disease, we can educate to prevent financial abuse, or provide treatment for those already affected." Richard and the Hammond Construction Board approved the program immediately, allocating additional funding beyond the original project scope. Richard's support was particularly meaningful. He understood better than most how financial control could be weaponized within families. "Kenneth learned his manipulation techniques somewhere," he told me privately after the meeting. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the family dynamics that enabled his behavior. Perhaps if Sylvia and I had modeled healthier financial relationships, things might have been different. Janet Sullivan covered the announcement in the Business Journal, bringing visibility to an issue rarely discussed in public forums. Her feature article, titled "From Victim to Advocate: How One Woman's Financial Betrayal Led to Community Innovation," generated unprecedented interest in the project, with other media outlets quickly picking up the story. The first workshop, held in a temporary space while the center was under construction, drew 37 women from diverse backgrounds, far more than we had anticipated. I stood before them, nervous but determined, my own experience now transformed into a source of strength rather than shame. "My name is Brianna," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "And 2 years ago, I lost everything when my husband manipulated me out of my inheritance and then left me. Today, I want to share what I learned through that experience. Not just how to recover financially, but how to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse before it's too late." As I spoke, I watched understanding dawn on many faces, women recognizing patterns in their own relationships, perhaps for the first time. When I opened the floor for questions, hands shot up across the room. "How did you know when to trust your instincts versus trusting your partner?" asked a woman in her 30s, twisting her wedding ring anxiously. "What documents should I be keeping to protect myself?" inquired another, taking careful notes in a small notebook. "How do you rebuild credit after financial abuse?" asked a young woman who reminded me painfully of myself 2 years earlier. Each question reflected the complex challenges these women faced, and while I didn't have all the answers, I had assembled a team who did, a volunteer network of lawyers, financial advisors, and counselors committed to supporting women in vulnerable situations. Carter Blake had been among the first to volunteer his services, recruiting several colleagues from his firm to staff monthly legal clinics. "Consider it penance for all the divorce agreements I've negotiated that inadvertently enabled financial control," he had said. Alexis Morgan, the forensic accountant who had helped uncover Kenneth's fraud, now led workshops on recognizing financial red flags. Detective Reyes conducted sessions on documenting financial abuse for potential legal proceedings. Even Jacob Wilson, Kenneth's former attorney, had joined our team, specializing in helping women understand the legal documents they were signing. The program grew rapidly, expanding from monthly workshops to weekly sessions with specialized tracks for different needs. We partnered with local banks to create financial education scholarships, with law firms to provide pro bono services for complex cases, and with employers to develop internship programs for women rebuilding their careers. What began as an educational initiative evolved into a comprehensive support network. Women who completed our financial literacy program returned as volunteer mentors for newcomers. Those who successfully navigated divorces from financially abusive partners offered emotional support to women just beginning the process. A powerful community of mutual aid emerged organically around the program's structured offerings. Lucia, the nurse who couldn't practice because her husband controlled their finances, received a scholarship to complete her U.S. certification requirements. She now works part-time at Denver Memorial while volunteering as a health educator at our center. Tamara, the accountant who lost her retirement savings, now leads our workshop on rebuilding financial security after 50. Her practical advice, tempered by personal experience, resonates deeply with older women facing financial insecurity after relationships end. Darlene, the young woman struggling with credit card debt, successfully challenged the fraudulent accounts her partner had opened and is now debt-free. She recently enrolled in community college, pursuing a degree in social work to help others in similar situations. By the time the Denver Community Health Center officially opened its doors, the Financial Empowerment Program had already served over 300 women. The pediatric clinic, my original dream, was fully operational, providing care to children regardless of their family's ability to pay. The building itself reflected our community-centered approach, bright, welcoming spaces designed with input from future patients and community members. Examination rooms featured child-friendly murals created by local artists. The community meeting spaces incorporated flexible designs to accommodate everything from support groups to job training programs. Even the landscaping had been planned with therapeutic benefits in mind, featuring a healing garden where patients could find moments of peace. At the grand opening ceremony, I stood beside Richard as he cut the ribbon, surrounded by community members, healthcare professionals, and many of the women who had found new paths through our empowerment program. The mayor presented us with a Community Impact Award, praising the project as a model of corporate responsibility and community engagement. Janet Sullivan approached me after the formal proceedings. "Quite a transformation," she commented. "From victim to community leader in less than 2 years." I smiled, reflecting on the journey. Not a transformation so much as a revelation. This was always inside me. The caregiver, the advocate, the educator. Kenneth's betrayal didn't create these qualities. It just revealed how strong they already were. "And what about Kenneth?" Janet asked, the journalist in her unable to resist checking for updates. "Have you followed his case?" "Not closely," I admitted. "That chapter of my life is closed." Later, that evening, I received an unexpected email from Carter Blake. "Thought you should know. Kenneth's plea deal was finalized today. 5 years, full restitution to Hammond Construction, and surrender of all offshore assets. Nicola got 2 years. Sylvia received probation and community service. Justice served, though perhaps not as completely as we'd hope. Congratulations on the clinic opening. You've turned poison into medicine." I closed my laptop, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Kenneth's sentence didn't erase the pain he had caused, but it provided a measure of closure. More importantly, his actions, intended to destroy me, had instead catalyzed my growth into someone stronger and more purposeful than I had ever been before. The clinic represented not just my professional achievement, but a profound personal evolution. The money Kenneth had stolen from me would have funded a small private practice. His betrayal had inadvertently led to the creation of a comprehensive community health center serving thousands. The pain of his abandonment had connected me to a community of women who now supported each other through similar experiences. The next morning, I would return to the clinic to welcome new patients, continue building the empowerment program, and work with women finding their own paths to financial independence. The future stretched before me, full of purpose and possibility. A future I had created from the ashes of betrayal. Our inaugural community newsletter included a feature on financial empowerment alongside healthcare information. In it, I had written, "Financial abuse thrives in isolation and secrecy. By breaking the silence and creating community, we deprive it of its power. No woman should face this journey alone." When people asked how I had survived such a devastating experience, my answer was always the same. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads to the best thing you could ever imagine, but only if you refuse to let someone else's betrayal define your story. In the 2 years since that devastating text message from Kenneth, I had lost an inheritance, a husband, and the future I had planned. But in their place, I had found purpose, community, and a far more meaningful path than I could have imagined. Kenneth had taken my money, but he had inadvertently given me something far more valuable: the opportunity to discover my own strength and to use that strength to lift others. The ultimate irony was that in trying to exploit my compassion, he had unleashed it in ways that would continue to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond his reach or comprehension. As I walked through the bustling health center on its opening day, watching women from our financial empowerment program volunteering alongside medical professionals, I felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun with betrayal had transformed into an expanding spiral of healing, growth, and community connection. My inheritance, intended to fund a small clinic, had instead through its very loss, catalyzed something far more powerful: a movement of women reclaiming their financial autonomy and helping others do the same. It was a return on investment that no financial advisor could have ever projected, and one that would continue to grow for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.